hierarchy never really goes away. Hierarchy is always there, but I think it is there in a very different form than it was before. Somehow previously you needed to embed hierarchy in formal institutions. You needed privileges, extra rights. In the more fragmented, multifarious structure of global governance that we have today, hierarchy comes out in different forms and maybe more informally. Some of the powerful, for example, they create institutions to their liking, and they create them in club form in order to exclude others and make sure that they can really control the institution. And that's much easier in an informal setting as we have now, rather than creating a whole multilateral organization like the UN, in which it's very difficult to create privileges. The informal is a particularly good vehicle. Think of the Financial Action Task Force, for example, which started as a Western club, very much dominated by the EU and the US, and has managed to structure the fight against money laundering and terrorism financing in ways that otherwise would hardly have been possible, and very much according to Western ideas about that. So I tried to use liquid authority to point us to the differences between how we're governed at the global level and how we are being governed domestically, or at least how we imagine to be governed at the domestic level. Right? We think of government as being a somewhat central institution that can issue commands, laws, decisions, and enforce them if we don't like them or we don't want to comply. And now, at the global level, of course, things are not like this. Decisions are dispersed across a much greater range of actors. They are much more softer in their form. They come as recommendations, guidelines, best practices. But it doesn't mean that these don't have a very strong impact. Think, for example, of the credit rating agencies, right, whose credit ratings constantly make governments jump and very much determine what governments can do, what space of action they have, but they don't come in the classical forms of hard authority, solid authority, as I call it. They're part of that broader liquid sphere in which different actors and decisions come together, less visible maybe and less clearly graspable than the solid authority, but nevertheless very powerful. International law has a bit of a difficult time these days, or at least it is being perceived to have a difficult time. But we also have to know that it has never been the central element governing the world. It has always been an important structure through which states can organize their cooperation. But it has never been a law maybe in the same way as we think of a law structuring interaction in society. And today it is still that important structure, and if we see how much is happening in international law, how much it is in the public eye, we can even think that it might be more important now than it was in the past. Think of the public discussions about the killing of the Iranian general Soleimani a few weeks ago, where the media were full of questions about whether this was legal or not legal. But that being said, there's of course something happening, and that is that in the broader structure of global governance, there are many other norms appearing, and in many other contexts, international law is maybe not as central or the only point of action. There are soft norms that I've talked about before, private norms being created, multi-stakeholder constellations and all the like. And international law as a formal structure of law created by states is only one among other legalities, if you want to call it like that, other normative orders, and it is at risk of being sidelined at times, at least in some areas. Think of, say, finance or tax, where formal international law is not as dominant as it maybe was, or at least it is in some other areas. Postnational, of course, is a bit of a catch-all phrase, but mostly pointing to the fact that states are no longer the sole or only central players that we have. Now, states are, of course, important, and they will remain important, and maybe even more so in a time of sort of nationalist backlash that we can see all across the world with Trump and many other leaders across the world trying to strengthen their national interest rather than international cooperation. But nevertheless, I think the state has lost terrain, both in terms of economic power and other forms of power, discursive power, to other actors. And these include sub-state actors to an extent, cities, regions, and regulators, but also private actors, multinational corporations, corporations generally, non-governmental organizations. And in many contexts, we see that the whole host of actors come together in order to create new norms. And we need these actors to come together also in order to effectively implement the norms that we create. So the range of decision makers in the post-national constellation is a much wider one, with states being important, but very much in a sort of redefined role, one of a managing entity rather than a commanding one.